One of my favorite old movies, I guess it's getting old now, is the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray in it. Remember this? It was back in the 90s. He was a weatherman who found himself in Punxsutawney for the Groundhog celebration on February 2nd, and then he wants to get out, if you remember, and then he wakes up the next morning still in the same place. And the whole idea of the movie is that he keeps waking up and having to relive Groundhog Day over and over and over again. And he realizes he's stuck in this endless, monotonous prison, basically, where he can't get out of. And so what does he do is he thinks, well, if everything I do has no effect, then I'm just going to do whatever feels good, whatever feels right. And so right at the beginning, he's eating every dessert, he's smoking cigarettes, he's drinking coffee from the pot. And he's like, what does it matter? He's going to have the same day tomorrow as I did today. And then remember, he runs into Needle-Nosed Ned, the insurance salesman, and he punches him out, and he chases after women. And then eventually he figures out how he can rob a bank and use the money to. It doesn't matter what he does, because the next day he wakes up again, and it's as if the last day didn't happen at all. And eventually he just turns to despair, where he's like, it doesn't matter if I just take my own life, because even if I kill myself, I'm going to wake up in Punxsutawney again the very next day. And eventually, it's kind of weird. Eventually he says, well, as long as I'm going to wake up, I'm going to try to build knowledge. And so he takes piano lessons, and he learns French poetry, and he starts ice sculpting. And he starts helping people, where he saves a kid who falls out of a tree, changes the flat tire of an old lady who has a flat tire. And nothing ever changes, though, until he realizes basically how he gets out of this endless cycle of curse, if you will, of reliving the same day, is when he really, he looks at the woman he's fell in love with, Rita, and says, I don't know what will happen tomorrow. All I know is I'm happy right now. And that's kind of the point of the book of Ecclesiastes, where the author is kind of making this point that we're in this monotonous prison where nothing we ever do really changes anything, but the only way we can have a meaningful life in this meaningless existence is to find satisfaction and contentment in what God has given to us. If all we have is what we have right before us, it feels like we're in this endless loop of monotony that doesn't have any meaning. And what the book of Ecclesiastes is getting us to see is using the words that he's using here to push us to realize that we have what God has given to us. Realize what we have right in front of us. That's what, the point of the movie was dude, you got what you're always looking for. You already have right in front of you, but you didn't open your eyes to see it, And it took him, some movie critics have said that he was in that loop for 30 years. I don't know how they came up with that, honestly. I think it's kind of funny to think about. But remember, there's this scene in the movie where he actually comes to this realization right before he does something stupid at the beginning. He's sitting at the bowling alley with two locals, and they're drinking beer, and he says, what if you were stuck in one place and every day was the same and nothing you did ever really mattered? And the two guys were like, yep, that describes my life. And it reminded me of the preacher, Matt Chandler said, whether we like to admit it or not, our lives are a lot like Groundhog Day, What we do on Monday, we get up, we take a shower, we go to work, we get the kids ready for school, and then we, have lunch, and then we'll get through the afternoon, go home, take care of the kids, watch some TV, go to bed, and what we do on Tuesday is the same thing we did on Monday, right? And there's a lot of songs, and there's a lot of, if you maybe even think about your own life, you can say, I could see that, and it's crazy to me how many, country songs, in particular, are, working for the weekend all week long, get up, punch the clock, working 9 to 5. How many songs are all about just working for the weekend, trying to get to the weekend, to try to, to make the whole 5 days of work at least have a little bit of something different, breaking up on the weekend. And so many of us have, either now in our life or at some point in our life, have turned to substances I just blow my whole paycheck on going to the casino, or I'm just going to spend whatever I can on drugs or alcohol, or we turn to romantic relationships from thing to thing, or we try to get more stuff, or some even look to religion, thinking that rituals will make some semblance or meaning out of this life. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, we see this guy who's writing from these experiences that I feel like if we haven't struggled with these things, we are going to, but most of us have as adults. We've seen that there's got to be something more, we ask ourselves. There's got to be something more. That's why And basically, the book of Ecclesiastes, he concludes in the end that everything is meaningless. And so I've titled this sermon series on the book of Ecclesiastes, The Search for Meaning. Ecclesiastes, The Search for Meaning. And a person could read a section of the book of Ecclesiastes, or you could read the whole book and walk away thinking, man, this is the most depressing book in the Bible. It's like Groundhog Day. But why does God even include this in Scripture, right? Well, I don't think that the point is to make you feel hopeless and dejected. The book is not written to make you give up hope, but to make you humble and to cause you to turn to the one who can give life to give meaning to your life. And I think the point is to force you to come to the realization that life is hopeless without God and that everything is meaningless without Jesus in your life. Life is hopeless without God, and without Jesus, everything is meaningless in your life. So we're going to do a brief overview of the whole book of Ecclesiastes, and then we're going to look at the very first section, the very first poem that the author is writing. So Ecclesiastes, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I wonder how many of you have actually read the book of Ecclesiastes. I said I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but that's fine. I'll just say you don't have to. It's okay. Because I'll tell you what, it's not really, the number one selling devotional book is not going to be from the book of Ecclesiastes, you know. In fact, it's not a real big go-to for most preachers either. I've never preached the book of Ecclesiastes. I've never heard a sermon series through the book of Ecclesiastes. And what's funny is that the book is actually, even though there's not a lot of sermons and not a lot of commentaries, even if you go back like to the Reformation era, they weren't even writing a lot of commentaries on it back then either. Like, there's just not a lot of material of people talking about it, which is funny because it's actually quoted a lot. As we go through this, you're going to recognize a lot of verses. I mean, you're going to read things, you're going to be like, oh, you know what? The book of Ecclesiastes is quoted at weddings and at funerals. I've heard it in the last few months. In my experiences, I've seen it used at a wedding and a funeral. So, I mean, there's even a famous song from chapter 3. To everything, turn, 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 right? There is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven. It was by the Byrds, not the Beatles. I thought it was the Beatles. It's the Byrds who wrote that. Very famous song. Ecclesiastes is classified as wisdom literature. Now, there's 3 other books classified as wisdom literature. There's Psalms. Psalms is kind of hard to fit Psalms into wherever. But you got Proverbs, and you got the Song of Solomon. Job, too. A lot of people don't know how to classify Job either. But right smack dab in the middle of the other wisdom books, you find the book, right after the book of Proverbs, you find the book of Ecclesiastes. Whenever you're reading a book of the Bible, you need to know what genre of scripture you're reading, because the Gospels are written different than the prophetic literature, and the epistles are written different than history, and wisdom has its own category on its own. So you need to know that this is what's called wisdom literature. So you'll see some similarities to the book of Proverbs or the book of Psalms. And in fact, it reminds me of Proverbs in some ways, because we preached through Proverbs a few years ago, and Proverbs will have, it's confusing too, because Proverbs will have one verse and then have another verse that seems to contradict what you just heard. It'll say like, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. And it'll say, don't answer a fool according to his folly, or he's going to appear wise. I'm like, well, which is it, right? You read Proverbs, and you got to really think as you're reading through the book of Proverbs, like, why did he say it like this, or why did he repeat himself? Because Hebrew poetry is repetitive in nature. One of the crazy things about Ecclesiastes is, honestly, we don't know for certain who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. It doesn't just announce it. We'll go here in a second. It looks like it does, but we really don't know for certain who wrote it. Verse 1 says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, it says the preacher, capital P. The word "the" is not in the original language. In the book of Hebrew, the article is there, but in chapter 12, but in chapter 1, it just says in the words of preacher. I don't think that's his name, though. I don't think preacher is his name. Some people think that's my name. Hey, preacher man. You know what I mean? Not my name. My name is Eric. You can call me Eric. But the author identifies himself as preacher. Now, that word in Hebrew is koheleth. It literally means, I just tell you because it literally means a collector of sentences. A collector of sentences. And it could be used as a leader or a speaker or a philosopher or a spokesman and somebody who speaks in an assembly of people. And that's also why the NIV and the Christian Standard Bible will say preacher instead of teacher, because there's some nuance to that word. It generally refers to the gathering or assembling of a group of people, especially as they gather to worship God. So instead of thinking of it like a classroom, I like the way the ESV says it's preacher instead of teacher, because it's more identified as when somebody speaks whenever God's people gather, and he's preaching wisdom to a gathering of the Lord's people. So that explains a little bit about who the author is. And it does say the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, son of David was Solomon, right? He was the first son of David, but anybody who was in the line of David could consider himself a son of David. And there were many more kings, not just Solomon. The reason why I actually do think of Solomon is because it kind of sounds similar to some of the Proverbs. And you'll see as we go through this, some of the ways that he identifies himself, I think it was Solomon. Again, there have been cases made for not being Solomon because the writing style is a little different, as you're going to see. And, but I do think it was Solomon who wrote this. Now, Ecclesiastes, where did that word come from? It's a form of the Greek word ecclesia. Ecclesia in the New Testament is the New Testament word for church. So the first disciples, even people that lived 100 years before Jesus, they could have read the Old Testament not in the original Hebrew, but in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was called the Septuagint. So people in Jesus' time, they could have, like we have a Bible in English, they could have picked it up in their common language, which was Greek. And so many scholars about in the 3rd century BC translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek so that the common people could read it in their language. So we learn a lot about the meaning of some of these Hebrew words and the nuance of like, what did they mean? Because words change a little bit over time in meaning, but you could look and see how the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament and what is some Greek New Testament words that are similar. Well, there you go. There's one of the words, and that is ecclesia in the New Testament means church or assembly of called out ones to gather together. Is ecclesia. It's the word that the New Testament uses for church, and that's the same word for Ecclesiastes. That's where that word comes from. So assembly of a congregation is where we get the word Ecclesiastes from. And that's another reason why I think this is kind of like the preacher. He's speaking these words or collecting these sentences for God's people here. I'll tell you right now, like I said, it is a little confusing. So I want you to look with me in chapter 1, and then we're going to look at the very end of chapter 12, because I want to start with the very beginning and look at the very end, because there is, even though I believe it's written by one person, he writes as if he's one guy quoting another guy. So he starts at the very beginning, and he's speaking in two different voices. So he says, these are the words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. So the author is giving us the words of the preacher. Does that make sense? So in other words, he's like, I'm not saying this, the preacher is saying this. So again, it could be a different person who has collected these sayings and was the author, but he's saying, I'm collecting the words of the preacher. And then turn with me in your Bibles over to chapter 12, verse 8, because he is quoting the preacher. He goes from the first person to the third person, but then if you look at chapter 12, verse 8, he goes back and starts quoting his voice again and says, in verse 8, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. And look at verse 9. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. See, that's why I think it was Solomon, because I think the preacher is Solomon. He did collect a lot of proverbs in his life, and maybe it was a different author, but there's like two people side by side, one who's the author and one who's quoting the preacher. And so in verse 9, he goes back and says there are other things that the preacher has said, but the language is in that of the preacher. So back to chapter 1. I think that's kind of confusing, but like I said, if you could just keep in your mind there's the very beginning and the very end, and now we have the collected sayings of what he's saying there in the middle. And he begins in chapter 1, verse 2, and says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Okay, and then from here on else, it's the preacher's voice. So he kind of changes right there. But he quotes this. This is one of the most well-known phrases in the book of Ecclesiastes, is this phrase. he ends the book, too, in chapter 12, verse 8, by saying the very same thing. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. This is confusing. It's well known, but it's confusing here. First of all, the reason why he says vanity of vanities, he's basically saying vanity to the highest degree. So the way he's writing there is kind of like how in the Old Testament, if you remember, the most holy place was also called the Holy of Holies. That's the way you would describe that was the most holy place. Or the book, Song of Songs. It was like the number one song. So vanity of vanity is the highest vanity. We know that it's also really important and nuanced because of the way the different English translations of the Bible translate this. All is vanity is translated here in the NIV, it's meaningless. It actually says meaningless, meaningless, all is meaningless. The Christian Standard Bible says it's absolute futility, not just vanity of vanities, but it's absolute futility. And then the ESV says the word vanity. Anytime you see words repeated over and over again or different things there, you know it's different. It has like this special nuanced meaning. And as I was studying, I actually came up with I don't know Hebrew. I actually wish, kind of like Groundhog Day, he learned to be that. Everybody thought he learned piano in one day because he just kept taking lessons little by little. A foreign language is like that. You would know, Joel. I don't know. Either you grow up in it or you have to learn it a long, long time. Like I've been learning different languages my whole life, right? Well, I wish I knew Hebrew because even the pronunciations, I try to listen to Jewish people and I don't really get it too much, but the word is hebel or hevel. And it's used, I do know this, it's used 38 times in the book because you can do a word search. 38 times that word hebel is used there, and you can look it up there. It means breath or smoke or idols or vapor or mist. So all these different ideas, how it's been used in all different parts of the Old Testament there, or it actually can be rendered, and this is one I kind of like, is temporariness or transition of transitions. Everything is changing. Change is everywhere. And I like that because that word, vanity, is used with a picture of smoke or mist because it's used as a metaphor because life is temporary. Life is fleeting. It's like a wisp of smoke. It's like James says, what is your life? It's like a mist in the morning that appears just for a brief time and then it's gone. And it's used also because life is kind of like an enigma. It's a paradox. It's like smoke where it appears solid, but you can't grab a hold of it. Like we have these ideas of beauty and justice and goodness, but it's really hard to put into words what those things are. And the author of Ecclesiastes, or the preacher I should say, he says that vanity of vanities, like life is like chasing after the wind. That's another one of those phrases we're going to see a lot. It's chasing after the wind. You can't catch the wind, right? It's hard to find that, but that's what life kind of feels like sometimes, as if things don't have any meaning. And verse 3 is, so he starts with that, but then verse 3 is the question that was just answered in verse 2. So verse 3 is the question. Verse 3 says this, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? So the preacher's reflecting on the idea of people's gain or their advantage as life under the sun. Under the sun is a phrase that will appear 12 times in the book. So again, it's another really important idea. And he asked that question. That's kind of like the most highest question of questions. Is like, what good is it? What do we gain? What is it all about? What do I profit? And that's what he says. What does a man gain? What does a man profit by all the toil, all the work? The idea of gain or profit means what is left over, what remains. And it is a commercial term used ordinarily in the context of business. It refers to the surplus, something left over after all of your expenses has been paid. And that's the goal of anyone who's working in a business, is to turn some kind of profit. If not, you shouldn't be in business, right? You got to have some kind of reward for your work. As a bottom line thinker, the preacher is looking to get a return for his labor. He's willing to work hard, but he wants to know, what's the point? What's the answer to that question of why am I working so hard? And he wants us to consider, like, what's your life going to look like when everything is said and done? What's your life going to look like when it's time for your funeral, time for your burial? And actually, I think there's nothing that causes us to look into that question, ask that question so much as going to a funeral. When I was starting out, I remember somebody gave me advice. They said, walk to a wedding and run to a funeral as a preacher. Walk to a wedding, run to a funeral. It means like don't miss an opportunity to go to the funeral. And I had an opportunity this week to do another funeral. And people are very sensitive. And I know, because, I know myself. I've gone to funerals of my loved ones. Like, there are a lot of people that are questioning things and asking things and thinking about things at funerals. And that's what he says there. What's going to be gained by all your toil under the sun? And he actually says, under the sun, it's nothingness. So here in these first 3 verses, if it's just under the sun. If all you're working for is just here, it's really, there's nothingness. And really the whole book is now set up by these first 3 verses. Now from here on out, that's kind of like his theme. As I've said, I've told you all those words that you see repeated so many times. That's kind of his theme for the book now. So going forward, he kind of unpacks all of that. And he tries to target all the ways that we try to build meaning and purpose in our life apart from God. And so in these next 11 verses, the first poem of the Bible here, of this book of the Bible, we see that everything is meaningless without Jesus because all of the activity that we're trying to do is all pointless. Ultimately, there is a lot in this world that we can't control. There's a lot going on that we can't control. And to prove his point that we have nothing to show for all of our effort, the preacher lists a lot of different things that seem to not go anywhere, that seem to not change. And the first half of his poem here, he gives examples from creation in verses 4 through 7. And the second half, he gives examples from human experiences in verses 8 to 11. But whether we look at the world around us or consider our own life, basically the point is still the same, that there is nothing to gain. We like to talk about improvements in society and economic development and technology advancements and everything and evolutionary improvements or whatever, but he's saying in the end, it's all a myth. There's never really truly any progress, but it's the same old, same old. So he starts in verses 4 through 7 with nature, and there's 4 different aspects of nature there: earth, wind, fire, and water. So look in verse 4 here. He says, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. People often talk about cultural progress or how they identify how they think things are going in the world or how they think things are going in the world by saying, we want to leave the world better for our children. Or I've heard people say, I hate to think of the world we're leaving behind for our children. Whether they're optimistic about the future or pessimistic about the future. They think, well, maybe things will be different in the future with the next generation. Because we've named all these generations like the baby boomer generation, Gen X, or millennial generation, or Gen Z. And there's a new one now. It's called Generation Alpha. Those born between 2000 or 2010, I think, and going forward. The point is that generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever, he says. We've been watching the show, my wife and I, this backdrop of Montana with the wide open spaces, and it's kind of like a soap opera in a sense, but we like part of it is because this beautiful pictures of Montana. They show big valleys and big mountains. And in one of the episodes we recently watched, there's somebody from that area whose family had been there for 5 generations, and somebody from a city in California, and they're standing there together, and the person from Montana says, we build cities, and cities always crumble. And I'm like, you know what? Our streets always crumble. My goodness, right? It's amazing to me how fast an abandoned house here in Swissville, how fast nature will take it over. It's I remember when somebody lived in that house and now it needs to be torn down. It's worthless. You can't even rebuild it. It's better to just tear it down and rebuild if you're going to rebuild. It's cities and things that mankind builds, truly, maintenance is ridiculous, right? They crumble so quickly. And the person in this scene was saying, look at these mountains. Aren't they just amazing? Aren't their mountains beautiful? And she said, these mountains were here for 1,000 years before any of us showed up. And they're going to be here for 1,000 years after we're all gone. And that's kind of the point that Ecclesiastes is making here. He says, generations come and generations go, and the earth remains forever. Similar to what Jesus said in Matthew 8:16, what would it profit a man if he gained the whole world and loses his soul? What if you would work, and let's say you could buy the mountains, right? You could buy all the rivers, buy the Rocky Mountains. What good is it going to do if you lose your soul? Because your soul is forever. Secondly, he says, consider the sun. Verse 5 says, it rises and the sun goes down, and it hastens to the place where it rises again. The sun comes up, the sun goes down. And then it says it hastens. It runs really quickly. That word means pants, which is funny. The sun is panting. It's like the sun is this exhausted track runner. You ever run track, You run real hard and you end up where you started, but more out of breath. So you make another lap, and you're still out of breath. You make another lap, right? That's kind of the picture that the author is painting here for the sun. The sun rises and it sets, and then it goes back again. But it's actually not out of breath. The sun isn't tired, but the sun is weary as it slowly makes its way across the sky. And a lot of times we turn to nature to find encouragement for the soul, but the preacher's looking at the sun and saying, look at that, even the sun, it just keeps doing the same old, same old. And next he looks at the wind in verse 6, expressing the same idea as the sun. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around it goes. I've heard some people say that the preacher, whether he knew it or not, he's kind of describing the jet stream. Meteorological phenomenon that we just learned about in the last 100 years or so, maybe a couple 100 years if we're lucky, right? But it kind of sounds like that. He's describing how the wind goes on its course and how it runs its route around the earth. The point is that there's a lot of activity, but the sun shines and the wind blows. And there's a monotony about both of those things. And then the fourth and final illustration is that of the water cycle in verse 7. All of the streams of the earth run into the sea, but the water level never gains. We've got streams and rivers flowing that never seem to run out of water. I'm always amazed by the fact that we don't know exactly how much water there is in the earth. We were visiting on our vacation in Lake Superior, and that thing is so big. I knew the Great Lakes are great, right? But I never realized Lake Superior was that big. So big that 10% of the world's fresh water is just in Lake Superior. Like Lake Superior, if you took all the water, it would cover the continental United States 5 feet deep. It is that massive, that big. It's that deep. When I was little, in fact, before I was born, my dad would drill wells. He had a well digging outfit there in Indiana, where we're from, rural Indiana. And I was always like, wait a minute, how do you find the water to drill a well? There's ways you can look at the landscape, but partially, in the Midwest even, it's kind of like, wherever the person wants the well, you start digging until you hit water. Now I'm like, you mean to tell me we're just on a bunch of water? There's water under, you don't even know where there's water sometimes. That just blows my mind to think of God's creation and God's nature, and the fact that we're never running out of water. Water will evaporate, it will freeze, but we probably have the same amount of water on earth as when God made the earth. And the point here that he's trying to make by looking at all these different aspects of nature, whether it's earth, or whether it's wind, or whether it's water, or whether it's the sun, is that everything kind of seems to be in a rut. So what's the point? What's the profit? You can spend your whole life working for one company, and what do you gain for your toil? Or what do you show for all the work that you do around the house? There's always another meal to prepare. There's always more things to clean, more clothes to wash and fold. We're trying to get our kids to to empty the dishwasher, and they're like, I just emptied it 2 days ago. I'm like, I know, and you've eaten 6 times since then, But they're starting to get it, right? Everything is meaningless. It's a Bible lesson we're trying to teach you guys. He says that he lists those things, and then in verses 8 through 11, he goes on and he says there's 3 behaviors that he kind of goes along with those movements of nature. He said, in verse 8, he says, all things are full of weariness. And then he says, we're never going to be able to say enough, we're never going to be able to see enough, and we're never going to be able to hear enough. We cannot say enough words to find the meaning in the midst of this life. So you can keep on posting on social media, it's not going to help. And then he says the eye is not satisfied. The eye is never going to see it all either. There's always going to be more sights to see, more experiences to take in, and pictures to look at. That you think by looking at those things, I'm going to be satisfied once I look at this. It doesn't work. And the ear has never heard it all either. So there's always more gossip to spread, more songs to hear, more jokes to listen to, more enticing words that you think, okay, you know what? This is going to do it. But nothing we can say or see or hear can bring meaning to this redundancy of life. Is there anything new even? He says, well, not really. Look in verses 9 through 10. Things happen, that's going to happen again. And the new and improved thing is just a repackage of the old things. It is what it is. I like how verse 9 and 10, like you can see the poetry in his words. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Even the translation to English, it has a nice ring to it. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? Nah, it has been already done in the ages before us. And so he says, well, you know what? It's just going to be what it's going to be. And you know what? You know why? Because this world is full of sinners. This world is still filled with imperfect people that are going to keep on hurting people. Like it says in the New Testament, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. There's going to be people fighting. There's going to be bad things happening in this world. And to top it all off, the preacher says in verse 11 is that no one's going to remember you anyway. People try so hard to be remembered, but most of us will be forgotten. And it's possible that in 100 years, no one will remember that any of us was here at all. Such is life under the sun. Again, under the sun. But what if there was one above the sun? What if there was a being that stood outside of space and time? In a world full of grave plots, what if there was an empty one? Well, that would change everything, wouldn't it? What if there was a promise for life above the sun? Life is meaningless if there is not a creator behind it all. Life would be hopeless if Jesus didn't break into our sin-filled dark world in order to save us from death and destruction. In order to save us through his death and resurrection. What good would it be if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? Well, that's kind of a dumb question, right? There would be no gain at all. You know, Jesus said that because he wants us to trust our eternal life to him, to trust our soul to him. Jesus died to save you. You know, there's more than just the sun and the wind. There's more to life than just our work. There's more to life because we know that God is behind it all. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 12. We started at the beginning. We're going to end at the end of Ecclesiastes 12. Because since we started at the very beginning, I want to end with the very last verse. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13. Because when all is said and done, the author says this, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So he says, you know what? This life is passing away quickly. So we need to put our hope and trust in the one who has saved us from this life. We need to put our hope and trust in Jesus. Fear God and keep his commandments, and your life will have meaning.